even though Teddy's seen as like, he's a good, people love him. Like I think as you get out of school, when you're a kid, you know nothing about him, and he's just the guy with the mustache, or he's Robin Williams in those movies.
Bully! Got you, boy.
Welcome to Questioning History, where a group of guys with all the questions have none of the answers, but they ask them anyways. We are joined here yet again by Cody from Alternate History Hub. How are you?
Good. How are you guys?
It's really hot here.
I know it's definitely hot here too. I think it's like 102. So it's good. I have my pop with me, so we'll have some refreshments. Yeah. But thanks for having me. It's good to
my soda as well.
Julian. I don't know where I felt like I get a little drink around here, do you, bud?
Yes. We gotta complete the trifecta. Actually, people down here say Coke, so I should be saying I'm drinking a Coke, even though it's a Pepsi. So I never even really drink Coke. I never really drink Pepsi. It's just right now I'm going through a Pepsi phase, I guess. I don't know.
I know
But,
this video is sponsored by Pepsi.
No. This is so bizarre.
It's actually it's sponsored by both, and they're just competing. So
yes, yeah.
I won't go through the rabbit hole, but I am not kidding when I tell you there is a divide in Quebec. If you're French, you like Pepsi. If you're English, you like Coke. And that is not a joke.
Wow.
And there's also
what is there?
It's a color thing.
It's just a color. Is it because the Pepsi looks like the French flag?
No way.
And there's also, and this is more bizarre, there's a war between Joe Louis and Mae West. And it's actually kind of a slur to say you like a Mae Wester. It's kind of weird.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm learning a lot more about Quebec than I ever thought I would.
I think actually after the last episode, which might be titled "Fuck France," as far as I know at this point, I'll just gonna say here for 5 seconds. Je ne teste pas le français. C'est juste une blague. So don't kill me. And ma blonde est une Québécoise, so like, calm down. We don't hate the French. Leave us alone.
It's a good disclaimer.
All right. So what is some of the topics in the last one that we can now go in more in depth? Like Cody, what was some of the ideas that we can now expand upon and freely roam?
I love the question that was about the alternate history, like misconceptions, like the ones that the one about World War II and Germany expanding and like they were gonna take over the world or something.
Yeah.
I liked the small little events that expand and explode. And I also liked the just talking about Teddy Roosevelt a lot. That was hilarious.
Always a good time.
Oh, always a good time. I don't know. I think you going through and just destroying all of our points in that second to last question, that was when I was like, oh, I'm not equipped for this. I did not come. 2 times speed. Accidentally put the settings wrong. But yeah, there were all of the questions I loved, and I know it sounds like a cop-out answer, but we spoke for so long that it's just I'm gonna have to go through and be like, what was the questions we had at the beginning again? I'm trying to, or each one was a gauntlet. Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with Teddy, I feel like. And I'm gonna be straight up honest. I like the guy a lot, but I don't know a lot about him. I know like the headlines, national parks, negotiating with Japan, but maybe even like, okay, first question for you guys. How much of because I was gonna assume that the American audience knows him quite well, but is that true?
I'm not American, but I would assume if I had to know a president the most of, it's George Washington or Teddy or Lincoln.
I think one of the most endearing things, probably why a lot of people in the history community really like him, at least in the American history audience, is he's kind of slept on. Like, we never learn anything really about him in school.
Really?
You hear about the Washingtons, you learn about the Lincolns. What Roosevelt's seemed like the base in and there's even a joke in epic rap battles of history, like Teddy
If Rushmore
Roosevelt
was a
said,
band,
if
then
Rush
you'd play
was,
bass.
then you'd play bass. Yeah.
Such a
So
good line.
even though Teddy's seen as like, he's a good, people love him. Like, I
Mhm.
think as you get out of school, when you're a kid, you know nothing about him, and he's just the guy with the mustache, or he's Robin Williams in
Bully! Got you, boy.
in
Yeah.
those movies. But other than that, like nobody knows anything about the monopolies or trust
Okay.
busting,
Let's let's break that now. If you have to, let's say in the span of 5 minutes, give a short biography of him. The
Okay.
floor is yours, and I'm genuinely curious, and this would really be probably my most in-depth jump into his life.
Oh man. Okay. Well, not pressure or anything. So
No pressure.
Roosevelt. Yeah, no pressure. So Roosevelt, he was kind of the president that wasn't supposed to be picked. He had always been sort of an enemy of big business during the Gilded Age, and during the Gilded Age, I mean, it was only
Gilded
really
Age?
comparable. The Gilded Age was pretty much today, but in the 19th century, it was oil and steel, and the big industrial sectors were monopolized by a single business. So, say oil was owned by one big business, Standard Oil, and Standard Oil was owned by Rockefeller, and Rockefeller was essentially he was the Bezos of the 19th century, but to even more of an extent. Like the way that monopolies worked in the
Wow.
19th century was they owned the railroads, they owned every single line of production, and they didn't have to. They pretty much controlled the rules, and they were affecting democracy itself. There was massive amounts of rampant corruption in the late 19th century, horrible working standards for the average person, and this led to riots. This led to the rise of unions. This led to people dying in the streets. Look up like the Pinkerton riots and the Pinkerton group. They were a private militia that would go in and be hired by these massive corporations to shoot at protesters, basically. So things were really bad in the 19th century, as well as I'm saying. Roosevelt was a Republican, and back then Republicans were both in the pockets of big business, but also were trying to they're also trying to break big business too. So we started seeing the rise of the first progressive movement, which is what Teddy Roosevelt really was the main figure for, at least at a national level. Roosevelt was seen as sort of a competition to big business, and they knew that if he was president, it would be the worst possible thing for them. So what in a funny act of corruption, basically the big business corporations and corrupt politicians put Teddy Roosevelt as vice president for the 1900 presidential ticket. And he was the vice president to McKinley. And McKinley was basically in the pockets of big business. Funny enough, though, McKinley ends up getting assassinated by an anarchist.
Yeah.
McKinley gets shot. And now
Okay.
Roosevelt went from the weakest position in office to the strongest. And what he did is he used his position as president to go full progressive. He basically started breaking the monopolies, trust busting, implementing these radical reforms that pretty much destroyed the original Gilded Age. And he broke up Standard Oil. And just to show how big Standard Oil is, most of the gas companies that we have today are just the subsections that were broken off of Standard Oil. So Exxon, Mobil. I'm trying actually. I know I'm in a rant, but I'm Standard Oil companies. I'm going to show you how big it is because I just look it up.
I've never heard about this the anarchist assassination.
Yeah, so McKinley was assassinated by an error. Okay, so just to show, so Standard Oil became it was broken up into a bunch of different companies, and those ended up becoming Exxon, Mobil, Amoco, which became BP, and then Marathon Oil, which became Marathon. So all of the big companies we had originated from the breakup of Standard Oil by Roosevelt. But
Wow.
Roosevelt was kind of seen as the, other than just his big business stuff, he was seen as sort of a man's man. He had this image, even though he was kind of a meekly nerd in his New York days. He had this aura of a rough rider, of a man who would go out and conquer nature. And by conquering nature, he ended up conserving nature because he wanted to have these landmarks of that future generations could enjoy. So through Roosevelt, we got the national parks. And in part, it was because he wanted to hunt, but it was also because he knew the beauty of North American nature, and he wanted to preserve that. There was a lot of stuff that Roosevelt did that was kind of not great. He essentially stole Panama from Colombia, and because he wanted to create the Panama Canal, and so he kind of set the precedent of the United States going in, undermining Latin American governments for that to happen. Pretty much creating, banana republics had kind of existed in some part, but he really was influential in spurring that new type of American imperialism. So, you win some, you lose some. He really didn't want the United States, or he really wanted the United States to get into the Great War, which was funny. He was just initially until the until it's really came out. But for the most part, I mean, Roosevelt is kind of a president that, for our current age, I think he speaks a lot to people.
Yeah.
And it's mainly just because of that monopoly breaking.
Yeah.
His movement as an early progressive and with the Bull Moose Party, I think a lot of people sort of equivalent that with like Bernie in some ways. But there's a lot of different, I'm not going to speak for everybody, but he was kind of seen as that political outsider that I think a lot of modern people really like, as well as bringing on real change that only a few presidents have really done. Like Washington was the first, and but he also did own slaves, and he was more of a figurehead in a lot of ways. He just kind of, like, everyone voted for him. He was just like, I'm president now, and he set a good precedent. But he's not anyone's like favorite by any means. Lincoln is probably the next, you could say, is as good as Roosevelt. And then I guess Jefferson, but Jefferson has all of his problems. Jefferson's kind of not seen as great today. But out of the total of American presidents, Roosevelt's aged the least bad, I would say. Let's say that.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. He definitely hasn't aged as bad as the others. The only thing I'd add on to that is, like, the thing that a lot of people don't know is the tragedy of his early life. That when his first wife died, it broke this man, and he literally went into the wilderness and disappeared. And he had like this huge career, very well educated, came from some money. Like he had fought like the big boy battles, and he was doing things. He goes off into the wilderness. The guy builds a ranch by himself. He's isolated. He becomes the sheriff of like this freaking town, and then he eventually buries his demons by just being this frontier guy, like literally. And he comes back into the world, and then he runs for president, even though he kind of, I felt like he didn't want to necessarily do that. And he was born with like terrible asthma, and the way to combat that is he just worked out.
Wow.
It's like, this is the man's man if you had to choose a president.
It's actually funny seeing, I saw a picture of him at 19 years old, and he was ripped actually at like 19. Yeah. And it's funny because you just associate him with like the guy with the small glasses and the mustache, but he had like massive, like,
I want to look that up hair. And Craig, you can put that on the screen in the edits. But 19 years old, jacked Teddy.
Yeah, and he just, but even then he did suffer from asthma and a lot of stuff, but he kind of just like worked through it. And because he was born to, he was born kind of privileged. He was born to a northern aristocracy in a way. And what he ended up doing is kind of temporarily rejecting that, giving this image that he wanted to, that he was just this Western man, and just sort of went with that until the day he died. Which is, I don't know, it's impressive. I don't know. I think there's a lot the main reason a lot of people really like Teddy is just because of the trust busting stuff. But he's also just such an energetic personality. He got shot, and I know that you mentioned it, the bullet. But he was the type that he got shot in the middle of a speech, and
Yeah.
he just kept on going. He did these ridiculous feats that just kind of are comical and also impressive. I mean, we got Teddy Bear because he didn't want to shoot a bear. But it's there's just a lot of things that he did.
All right.
Too much.
I want to pose something to you. What would create a more interesting scenario? Like, okay, let me say it like this. You have to make a video on either the anarchist does not make the shot and Teddy is VP, or the shot that ends up hitting Teddy, let's say it goes in the head and he dies.
Yeah.
Which one would make for a better alternative history scenario, and why?
I'm guessing you mean better as a more like interesting.
More
Like
interesting. Yeah. Not as a better world.
So I guess if the first one's McKinley doesn't get shot, really. Inevitably there was going to be some social movement to improve workers' rights. Like, they were so bad it was not going to just stay like that. Teddy Roosevelt certainly helped, but he wasn't the only one doing it. So I think if Roosevelt wasn't president, it would have been probably a bunch of smaller reforms. Maybe there would have been eventually a more extreme person that goes into office. I don't know. But I would imagine that reform would be a lot slower if Roosevelt wasn't in office. As for him getting assassinated, when did he get shot? I have to look this up. When did Teddy get shot? This is what a lot of alternate history is. It's just looking up questions to then think of the scenario then. Because what it affects is the policies he already made and how much of a prominent figure he already was. So when did he get shot? Was 1912. Okay. So when he was, that's already through.
That's pretty late in his career, right?
That's pretty late in his thing. So if he had gotten shot, a lot of ways he would have just kind of been martyred. He would have not been able to go and create the Bull Moose Party. Honestly, from a political standpoint, probably wouldn't have affected that much. I mean, maybe in his except for his push in World War One. Which I'm not super. You can add on to, because I'm not super well versed in what he did with World War One.
Yeah, so Woodrow Wilson was kind of fighting tooth and nail to just get reelected. That's honestly the reason why he was, trying to put up this neutrality stance for the most part. But there was a surgence to try and get the foot in the door to militarize the United States, to update it, because its army really needed, it was a bad situation. The United States wasn't prepared at all for World War One. And J.P. Morgan and all the financiers, they worked with this cabal with people who were trying to push to get a military program going and modernize things. And Teddy was one of the big voices. So he was one of the big guys that was involved. Without him, I don't think they would have had the club.
Yeah,
he was respected.
Wow.
He had a lot of influence and sway, and it's so funny seeing his how much he did push for it, and he was just like, anyone that doesn't is like a coward, and that real Teddy.
Splendid little war.
Yeah, splendid little war. He was expecting, he was expecting it to be like the Spanish American. I don't know. He never turned down a fight. That was what Teddy really was.
Yeah.
And he never turned down a fight.
But if Teddy wasn't president, it completely alters the entire Pacific War, because Teddy Roosevelt is one of the key players that put the bricks into what is going to be the Pacific War. He did the Great White Fleet. He put in Orange Plan Orange, War Dog Plan and all that. Everything was under his administration. Panama. He respected the Japanese, and he saw them as the threat that they were. And under his watch, a lot of the base of these plans that'll come off for World War II to combat Japan and have the strategic zone around the Philippines, and that a lot of it's him. So it changes so much. It's a lot.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. That's great. Yeah. Honestly, there's probably so many foreign policy things that he did that if he just wasn't there, it would have dramatically affected it.
Russo-Japanese War Treaty. If he's not there to claim that Nobel Prize for being the guy who just came in and be like, "Oh, you both aren't capable of fighting a bankrupt," I did everything.
All right.
Man.
Two follow-ups. One is really deep and it's about slavery. But first, you mentioned all the other big American presidents, but how do you compare with him with the other Roosevelt, with FDR?
That's a controversial question. There's so much of a debate between, like, because both Roosevelts were incredibly influential in much different ways. FDR, I think, even by conservatives today, is still seen as like the devil. He's still seen as the devil. He's seen as the one
political question, Cody.
You're inadvertently.
I didn't even know. I didn't even know.
Gun to his head. Well, like,
wow.
So FDR, it really is just what your view of government is. Whether he was good or not, FDR came in and he did the job that he did because America was in the Depression, but it's still debated to this day how influential the New Deal was, whether FDR made the whether he made the decision, whether he expanded the American government to a tyrannical extent. Every thing that FDR did is still kind of scrutinized by conservatives, or at least it's not like he's not seen as like just the devil. It's mostly just an eye roll, or it's just like FDR. But that's just any conservative I talk to. Wow. Roosevelt, I would say, is more liked by both sides, which is funny. Like Roosevelt's liked by conservatives. He's more like, he's more like, FDR had this aura of, aristocratic, sort of snobbery in a way. He was a rich kid, which isn't bad. He was still smart. He was still capable, but he was very, very northern, very, he came from privilege, you could see. Teddy came from privilege, but he didn't show it. But I mean, I like FDR for some things, and I dislike FDR for other things. But I think Teddy is someone that everyone can have a quality that they just really like, even if it's just, he has a funny mustache.
It's funny. You're asking us to compare Teddy to FDR when most people compare Teddy to Woodrow Wilson, but it's inevitable they overlapped and they ran really butted heads together. So
they're kind of, it's kind of funny. That shows how America has changed in just that first section of the 20th century. Is that the FDR not the FDR, the America that FDR was coming into was an entirely different America than the America that Teddy was coming into. And so it was like, basically, how do they compare as presidents? Well, it's like the American government essentially changed between both administrations. Like before Teddy, the American government didn't have really the authorization of smashing monopolies. And then under FDR, the American government gained pretty much like the political power that it does today. And whether or not that's a good thing is still debated. So I am not gonna answer that question. That's what
when I was a kid.
Exclusive.
Yeah.
But Teddy's usually.
Yeah.
No, continue. Sorry.
When I was a kid, I played a lot of Civ 4, and basically, for America, the three options were, I believe, Lincoln and Roosevelt, Lincoln and FDR. Maybe Ann Washington, I'm not sure, but back in those days when I wasn't that interested in history, those were I basically put them together as the greats, and I thought there was no real speculation. Everyone saw FDR as one of the greats, but interesting.
I mean, he's definitely he's still one of the greats of the 20th century. It's just it's still a political thing. It's still, people still debate it. I would say definitely on an international scale, FDR was very influential. I mean, both Roosevelts were definitely the most influential of the 20th century. Yeah. So, yep.
Yeah.
But
so to make it less controversial, I want to talk about slavery.
Oh, no.
but honestly, you mentioned slavery in reference to Washington and Jefferson, and
Yep.
I sort of agree with you, but it's like if we run this line, because I've heard this argument been made many times, like, oh, this person was great, but he had slaves, or he did this, or he did that. It's like Caesar had slaves. Like
Yeah.
most people throughout
Most
history
humanity.
probably had slaves. So how far can we go with this and taking away their achievements? Because Washington and Jefferson obviously had great
I
achievements.
see, this is man, this is a
The
political
worst of
question.
This is a
either
doozy.
question,
I would
dude.
say the difference I would say is that
All right.
modern slavery is a lot different than ancient slavery was. Slavery, and also the fact that nobody thinks of Caesar today. Like, I mean, other than us, like Caesar is influential. We know how influential Caesar is, but it's not like our government
Okay.
is based from Caesar himself. Um,
People are
I
also very ignorant
Peter
about
Peter would
slavery.
disagree with this
no,
statement.
I mean, literally, he's
Yeah.
not literally a founder that was. So you don't
Hmm.
have Caesar as one of the original. I would say the difference is that chattel slavery was still a lot different than slavery that was 2,000 years ago. And also, a prominent portion of the American population is descendants of those same
Okay.
people that were held in slavery. So that's one of the main reasons why there's a difference.
Okay.
And it also is in their basis of like the things that they wrote. Because yeah, we can say
Hmm.
they were founding fathers. They did found the country and write the documents that influence our laws today. But also, um, I mean, I'm trying to word this in a way that I don't get people pissed off at me.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
that slavery was just it's something that I can see why for many people
Hmm.
them owning slaves is a big deal, even despite prominent people throughout history owning slaves. It's like, yeah, they own slaves, but they didn't own their literal direct, people that are directly descendant from them today only like 200 years ago. So,
Yeah.
there's a difference between 1800s and like the first century.
I mean, it's interesting that you bring up the point about the years because it's like Ottoman corsairs, like when they were taking slaves from Europe. Why are they never talked about in this side of the
Hmm.
world when it's the same
Yeah,
time
they're seen
period?
as cool. They're seen as
Same time,
cool pirates.
1800s, the early 1800s, there's still some
Yeah.
slavery going around there.
Yeah.
There's slavery all around the world. The Atlantic slave trade was like 3% to North America. The rest is like in Brazil. But a lot of
Yeah.
people are ignorant to this too, especially in the United States. They don't think about the
Yeah.
grand scheme. They don't know about the Islamic slave trade that went on much longer.
Yeah.
But it's a cultural thing that's it's a hot button issue. It's always been.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel
I
you.
think it really just has to do with our, it's still prominent, I guess you could just say. Like there's still political and racial issues, and that's
Okay.
one of those things. Yeah. It's eh. That's the difference is the main reason.
I feel you. Yeah, and
It's
I've
like
gained a little bit more understanding now that you said that.
I live in
And
Canada and we
yeah, sorry.
were under the British system, so we abolished slavery a little bit a little earlier than the Americans, but
Mhm.
Yeah.
no one talks about slavery in Canada or anything like that. It's more about the Aboriginal situation, which actually is a hot button issue right now since the Pope's here
Yeah.
in our country apologizing.
I saw that. I saw all that fun.
Yeah, I work for Aboriginal Reserve, so it's a pretty interesting conversation.
Oh. Oh wow.
Wow.
Yeah. See, I think at the end of the day, it's just demographics. It's just we have higher percentage of demographics in the states that care about that stuff than, and then also because we don't really have much of an indigenous population anymore, that isn't as much of an issue in the U.S.
The
But
reserve
or they
system in the
mostly
U.S. is different. Yeah,
oh it's bad, but it's also like they just don't have the political weight that BLM or anyone really would have.
yeah.
So
It's funny. You really do, like because here in Canada, it's awkward for me to say I work for a reserve, but there's an enormous political power behind
yeah,
the reserves, and we have a lot of councils of First Nations. We got the Inuit, like the Cree, and all that, and they're
yeah,
consolidated, and they work by treaties that were like the Indian Act from a long time ago, and they abide by certain things, and there's a lot of
yeah.
strength in there. But in the United States, actually can't recall hearing too much.
Oh, it's completely different. Well, the way that the way that the U.S. interacts with natives isn't like a treaty system because the U.S. just threw all the treaties out. The way the U.S. interacts with natives is through the Department of Indian Bureaus. So this is a whole group of people that they aren't treated as separate nations. They're treated as just this, they're like the Department of Agriculture or Defense. It's just another thing that the federal government has to deal with. And it's like
that here.
yeah. So it's really it's because there's just so little of them anymore. They just they don't have political weight, and
they're the backdrop.
I think even like last month, the Supreme Court, in between, I don't want to bring up Roe v. Wade or anything, but in between all the controversial stuff they did, they also inadvertently weakened the autonomy of the Indian reservation system. So we're only going backwards, ironically. But yeah, the way the U.S. interacts with natives is a lot different. That's a very uncontroversial question. Georgie, thank you.
Thanks, Georgie. If you guys want to hear a statement that no one hears outside of like niche groups, universities in Canada, it's this unofficial slogan that Canada's had for a while, since like the 70s. It's multiculturalism, except for the natives.
Oof.
Because no one thinks about it like this, but the way that Canada did its immigration policies was like highly promoting all these different groups of people, like from immigrants who are coming from other countries, while simultaneously just suppressing and abusing the Aboriginals here. And it's like the most contrary system that we had, and it's still kind of like that. It's pretty sad.
Yeah, that's a good casual conversation. This is real uplifting.
Final note. But this is a little bit more of an uplifting note. Just a moment. I am genuinely wondering about this, and we're going back into alternative history territory. How, on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being impossible and 1 being I have no idea why this didn't happen in our timeline, where do you rank the idea of the founding fathers basically solving the slave issue then and there, or within the presidency of Washington?
0. Like zero. Yeah, half of them were like slavery was born within the foundation of the U.S. Like it was half of the. Okay, just to say, if they had settled the slave issue, if they had, which just means abolish, if they had abolished slavery, the 13 colonies revolution never would have worked. The South would have split off immediately, and it just would have failed. This has been something that the U.S., even ever since its inception, it's been just trying to kick down the can, and it was because it was always just a compromise. And there was no way the founders ever would have settled it. Yeah, they'd been like, oh yeah, slavery's abolished, and then the British probably would have just, well, honestly, if the U.S. did that, realistically, the British would have then went to the South and been like, because the South was already they were the most loyal to the British. So they would have sided with the British against the more revolutionary New England, and they would have just brought down that revolution immediately.
Okay, how does that number for you changes if I say alternative scenario where Jefferson abolishes it, or Washington?
They never. I mean, it's kind of like changing their. It's kind of changing their personality. Like when people speak of, oh, this founder had slaves, like it was an afterthought. It was not simply this founder had slaves. It was this founder made their money through slave exploitation. They had plantations. Not Roosevelt. I'm thinking of Roosevelt still. Jefferson's mindset for what the U.S. should be was every man owns a property and land, and they have a rural society. But in part of that plan, it was also slave labor. So this was ingrained into Jefferson, even though he wrote, the Declaration of Independence and sort of stuff like that. It was, you can have two different mindsets. You can have the mindset of freedom and revolution, but also still maintaining this economic, it was seen as an economic system that just, because if they removed it, it would have made them lose their money, essentially.
And you
So
say that, but in the same breath, you also say that you take a lot of the credit away from Jefferson and Washington because they had slaves, even though it was unavoidable. I'm just trying to wrap my mind around it.
it's Knowing Better has a really good video he just did. It was a
Mhm.
dichotomy between the way that whites thought about freedom in the revolutionary times. So basically anything that they wrote about freedom and independence was viewed from the idea of the European man declaring independence from this. This was values for your, you know, white person. Uh,
Hmm.
Slaves weren't even considered. They weren't considered anything. They were
Hmm.
literally chattel. It would be like saying, "Oh, what if we speak about revolution and independence, but what about the cows?" And that's what the
Wow.
mindset for Jefferson and Washington was they could talk in the same breath of freedom for a man, but also still
Huh.
own slaves because that was a non-issue.
Wow. When I saw
And
that
they
series,
got
John
like
Adams. Sorry.
John Adams was a well, John Adams was an abolitionist. And that's one of
Hmm.
the dichotomies between the northern states and the southern states. And I know I'm like gonna get a lot of shit for this, but it's like that's just how it was, is that uh it was seen as a unnecessary evil. It was seen as
Mhm.
oh, slavery will just die off naturally, so it's not as much of a thing to worry about now. Um so it's kind of just they're like talking themselves into just maintaining it. So it's
Mhm.
just like, oh yeah, we'll have, this does contradict our values. Northern people even said that the slave issue contradicts their values, but it was also something that you just never brought up because it would make the Southern people mad. And
Didn't they abolish the slave trade though? Like the
they
trade?
about they were going they okay, so that's the 1808 date.
I'm sorry I
Um,
keep digging. I just find
no,
this
no, 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 no.
fascinating.
It's fine. It's fine. I actually have been kind of wanting to get this off my chest for a little bit. So the 1808 date was kind of just pushing the issue back until they then would decide it. So
Yeah.
when they made that, it was
Mm,
pushing it back another 30 years, and then yeah, by 1808, then they banned the slave trade. But by then, it was a non-issue. It didn't matter because the slave population was doubling anyway, and you
mm,
had the cotton gin making slavery actually profitable. So slavery in the 19th century was a much bigger beast than it was at the time of the founders. When the
mm.
founders had slavery, it was it was still bad, but it was a lot of a smaller operation. Well, sorry, I'm mixing my words up. It was a smaller operation, mostly
Yeah,
focused on tobacco. And then once you had the cotton gin, then it became industrial slavery. It became
yeah.
massive. And yeah, it kind of took on another level that I think even the slave owning founders didn't really think it would go down.
Mm.
So
Yeah, the
yeah.
reason why we didn't have large scale slavery in Canada is only because we can't grow cotton.
Yep.
That was the only reason.
Wow.
Our
That's
agricultural
what
sector didn't.
Fun times, boys.
it's actually funny. One of the main reasons why the South can grow cotton is because the soil was actually the coastline of North America. I think during the Mesozoic era, most of the South was actually under a shallow sea,
Mm.
and it's made the soil so fertile that you could grow anything on it. So when
Wow.
you actually look at the coastline of, I think, North America 50 million years ago, it
Mhm.
is the exact same it's like the same map as the current day black population.
What?
Yeah,
Wow.
look it up. It is the same because that's where the plantations were originally. The plantations were at the most fertile area in the south.
And cotton, I'm
Whereas
assuming, is a very, what's special about it? It requires a lot of water, or
it can just be grown anywhere. So it's specifically grown in that area, and
okay.
it just led to it was the most prominent thing made in the plantations. But Yeah. Look it up. I don't know if you can do it in post or anything, but
You
it's
can,
one of
yeah.
the it's one of those strange things.
Wow, fascinating.
Mm.
How do we transition from that
Nice.
into
I don't
something
know.
more
You
cheerful?
Just
you made it. You went
American
right into the
That's
politics,
true.
darkness.
no. Slavery, no.
Okay,
Yeah, you
okay,
went
okay.
head first in the darkest stuff. Hot damn.
I'm not
I
even
liked it
American. I'm
though.
cringing here. I'm like, oh god.
I felt I couldn't really explain it because it's just
Yeah, yeah,
Am I wrong? Am I not? I don't.
yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry,
If
everybody.
you don't know, like, I'm from Bulgaria, and my perception of the world, even though it's very Western and affected by American society, I'm lacking some of these nuances that
Oh
you
yeah,
guys
no. I mean,
probably have.
this is like the most political stuff. This is
Yeah.
stuff that I'm probably gonna get so many people hating me on it. So it's like I, but I can't really explain it any other way. I don't know. It's
Yeah. I think
yeah.
from my perspective, you explained it very well, but let's see now. My first thought is like the cotton gin, and then what's an invention that did a lot of good for the world? Purely good. Uh you can think that for a second from the previous debates. What did Cody mention that he enjoyed that we can go dive? Like what's a small nudge in history that can cause a massive snowball? That when I came up with that, yeah, the butterfly effect. Like, what's a very small thing? Like, wasn't there a case of some guard in the siege of Constantinople? Not that that was gonna happen any other way with the Ottomans, but like he forgot to lock the gate.
Yeah.
There was a
that a
meme
myth?
like that. I don't know. I'm actually not sure about that one.
I remember I listened to Our Fake History once, and he did the siege of Constantinople. I think he talked about that.
I think there was God, Vsauce did a great video. I remember he did a video like years ago talking about I'm looking stuff up because there's so
No
many
worries.
things
I,
I remember.
I have a great one that's really
Yeah.
cool, but it's slavery connected again.
Damn.
Actually, no, that would be the perfect transition. I wanna get this off my chest, and it's perfect.
There you go.
So, picture this. You would never assume this, but Spanish gold actually led to the defeat of the Ottoman Navy. Here's how the story goes.
Okay.
There's a ton, and actually, sorry, silver. They bring in a ton of silver from South America, and it goes into Spain. It creates a massive surge of inflation, which we can probably relate to right now. But this inflation at that time of the world, it spreads geographically as a wave throughout time. So hear me out. The silver is abundant in Spain, and the inflation is the highest in Spain. So what that causes, what that creates, is a surge in slave ownership. Not ownership, but slave. Sorry about the cat. A slave. The galleys that they use in the Mediterranean suddenly became entirely slave-driven and very big. Their actual design of the hull had to change to carry that many bodies chained up on the bottom deck. And on the top deck, you had these heavily geared up musketeers, essentially, arquebuses, men who were really good at shooting, but also fighting in close quarters, heavy armor and stuff. So it was very heavy. It moves, and then you have Spanish-influenced Genoa, who their cargo was already pretty big because Genoa was more renowned for trading in bulk things like lump timber and big batches of salt and grain, while Venice was more, their galleys were a lot shallower and made to carry luxury goods like silk and spices and sugar. So Genoa uses a little bit of slaves. Spain uses a lot of slaves. Venice doesn't use slaves. Sometimes they it's like a criminal punishment. Like instead of being in jail, you're thrown into a galley and you have to roll. And very weirdly, the Ottomans, who are in the east of the Mediterranean, they do not use slaves. They may capture slaves here and there, and they use them for other purposes and sell them and stuff, but their actual galley design is the lightest of all. And to top it all off, they do not use gunpowder. They are entirely stacked with janissaries who fire arrows, and they're a little bit of good at everything. They're good at melee and they're good at ranged. And I forgot to say that about the Venetians. Venetian merchants were also the Venetian fighters. So they really didn't. There was not a professional soldier with Venice. So what ended up happening is they hated melee combat. The entire doctrine of naval fighting for Venice was ranged. And to top it all off, they invented the sailboat or gunboat. Like sails were invented, obviously, but Venice put guns on sail ships for the very first time, and they used them in the Battle of Lepanto. So economy and geography and culture, all of these things coalesce into the Battle of Lepanto, where the victory is brought by a combination of heavy armed Spanish ships who can do melee combat very well, and they're very heavy, and they smash straight through the Ottoman ships, combined with the extreme maneuverability of the light ships and range ships of the Venetian fleet. And together they coalesce in this coalition, and they beat the Ottomans at Lepanto, which in of itself is a cool story. But I like the fact that the inflation travels slowly, not like us. Like with the current world, with the globalization level it has, inflation can hit America, and within days, weeks, months, it's going to hit everywhere else. But when in that world, just imagine the society, how it took decades for the inflation from Spain to travel to the Ottoman Empire. And it did, because about 10, 20 years after Lepanto, Venice also started using slaves on their galleys. It was just inevitable. You can't afford wages for these people rowing galleys. It's just far easier to use slaves.
Man, that is that is a story. That is interesting.
Yeah, I love the way, like, some people focus down on like tactics and stuff, but I love the interaction between culture and economy and geography and all these things, and how they create stories together.
You know where the majority of the silver went? From the Spanish Empire.
Tell me. It went to China?
Late Ming and the Qing dynasty, all the silver, the world's silver, went to China. They hoarded it, and that's what led to the Opium Wars.
Wait, how did it go to China? Spain traded with China, and
China was trading with
Spain actually used one of the
Macau.
Philippines was one of the most prosperous trading centers, because Spain would travel across the Pacific and get to the Philippines, and then use the Philippines as a base for trading with China.
Wow. Yep. What were they buying?
Like silk.
Anything.
Silk. What's the pottery called?
Porcelain.
China?
Porcelain.
Yeah,
and China.
Japanese stuff. The Japanese weren't allowed to trade, with China, because there was the ban. So a lot of middlemen would go, like the smugglers, which ended up being like the Dutch, the British, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and such. But like for example,
I love that.
I bring it up cool because I do the China podcast for Kings right now, which is honestly a rehash of, because I did the Opium Wars my own channel a long time ago, and the Qing dynasty had the world's supply of silver, and when the British had to get tea fixed, because their people were literally addicted to tea and they were economically dependent on it, but the British ran into a deficient. They lost all their silver because of the American Revolution, because of the war with France. And China only accepted payments in silver. That's how they hoarded so much. So the British performed the opium trade in order to get silver to buy their tea. And,
so what did China use the silver for then?
To screw up their own economy.
Wow.
The Chinese, it's incredible. Like, if you look up a guy, He Shen, he was one of the most corrupt individuals in Chinese history. His wealth is legendary. And it's right during this time, just before the Opium Wars. The guy had, like, they say he has like walls of gold and all sorts of crazy stuff, and it's all silver, corruption, etc. Inflation in China it's insane. Like internal strife in China kills the most people in human conflict. But,
wow.
It's always funny to see like the four like highest, like the biggest death tolls in wars, and it's like most of them are just trying
Taiping,
the
Warring
the
States,
Heavenly Kingdom Wars. What was
Heavenly
what was the war? Yeah, what was the one with the Heavenly Kingdom? Was it called the
The Taiping is
something?
the Heavenly Kingdom.
Anwu
But there
Shan
is another.
Rebellion
Taiping.
also.
Right, Liu Shan. Yeah.
But
So there's
it's like
just
you
some.
say a civil war, and like, what is the bloodiest civil war in Chinese history? It's like, which one?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they have apocalypse levels of death, and then just rebuild a generation later. And it just
Are the
keeps
numbers
happening.
on those accurate?
The Taiping, they say like 20 to 30 million people, and a lot of I've heard 20 million could be the ballpark, but there's some.
Well, it's like
Like, how do you count that? Like,
well, they had a good accounting system in China. I mean, they've always
all right.
been pretty good, but they, like anyone else, they exaggerate. Of course, it's
yeah. Well, it's
And
one
did
of,
those
it's funny 'cause
records
you have-
survive the nationalists?
well, that's a good question. I don't know. A lot of sources I use are not good sources. Some of them are British and stuff. So
it's just funny going from like the Taiping, and then only like 30 years later, then you have like the Chinese Civil War, and you have World War II, and it's just like this span of 70 years where it's like this is 40K levels of people dying, and now I
Yeah.
guess they're almost a superpower today. So it's like, who knows? Imagine if America or any European country had like gone through that level of. I mean, I guess Russia is the best comparison, but Russia only had like. Russia's probably the best comparison.
You might like this. You might like this, Cody. I had to read some new sources because I'm doing the Taiping War soon, but I'm also doing White Lotus Rebellion. Why the Qing Dynasty took over. That's actually the best part to talk about this. There's a new amount of research looking at climate change because a large reason why China falls into these terrible situations is drought and famine and the overflowing of the river systems. And the argument now is it's these dramatic effects of climate change that just happen for a few years. They cause the famines and then the revolts and the peasants and everything, and it causes the mayhem. So there's like a lot of historians now who are talking about like the actual effect climate's having on wars, and it's pretty interesting stuff.
I may pitch in and say something very interesting, and I believe this will be in the history books pretty soon. It's a very recent discovery. The First Crusade happened because of climate change. So there was a particularly devastating drought in Egypt. And like, it was this very weird thing. Drought in Egypt, severe heats in one other part of the world, with severe winter in the Central Asiatic steppe. And as these conditions went harsher and harsher, all of these nomadic horsemen were driven into what's like Iran, and all this population movement coupled with the famine, like famine then comes in plague, and people are not as united, and these are one of the factors that allowed for the Seljuks to completely run down the entire Islamic world within like that. And the Seljuks and their treatment of the Holy Land was the big factor that and Manzikert, of course, that led to the Crusades to happen. But a lot of people don't talk about it. In fact, prior 10-20 years ago, the story of the First Crusade always began in Clermont with the speech, when in reality there's so many other factors, and you can wind down even back. But the real point you have to begin with is actually climate change. Egypt, which was the breadbasket of the entire Islamic world, really got hit so bad. And also in Europe, I found this fascinating. It's in the script. I can't remember the exact figures, but we actually have such a good record of the amounts of times famine and plagues are mentioned. The 4 years before the First Crusade happens, the number is like in total 70 times famine and plague are mentioned. It's rampant everywhere, which leads to all of these people who are desperate, who are seeing this as the end time and the apocalypse, and this created so much religious fervor. So when the Pope said that go to the land of milk and honey, a lot of people just had nothing to lose, and they joined in, and the People's Crusade happened.
It really is funny how many times, it's like for most of human history, people just think that the world's going to end, or like,
oh my god,
it's kind of like a historical grand scale of first person syndrome.
Yeah.
Like people, each generation thinks they're the main characters, and that like, oh, the world's gonna end on like at now. It's just coincidentally, it's all been waiting up for now.
Yeah.
And it's like I do not blame medieval people for thinking the world was going to end. I mean, if
Yeah.
imagine famines, like you said, or the crops are failing, or just everything's going to shit, and it's like, yeah, I don't blame them, but it's just funny seeing that happen throughout history, and it's like, oh, yep, the world's ending, and then
Yeah.
it just doesn't.
If
And
you
then
want to
we
hear a,
He-
if you want to hear a really funny one, I just
Yeah.
finished my episode on the White Lotus Rebellion, and the whole idea behind it in the 1790s is they thought an apocalypse was coming, and that they would have to form this like military to destroy everybody who's not a White Lotus follower, and that would usher in the new world. So they
Wow.
all started hoarding weapons, and they gained followers. It's like an it's like a pyramid scheme. So they got followers to hoard weapons. So they made the apocalypse happen.
Yeah, they went down the road that they were avoiding,
Yeah.
or whatever. Yeah,
It actually happens like that often. Yeah.
that's so funny. Yeah, but apocalypse happens a lot. That's good.
Apocalypse, and again attaching it to the previous topic with inflation. Have you guys ever heard of deflation? Have you seen it historically happen? Because
I can't. I've heard the term, but I can't think of a time that's happened.
In economic terms, I mean, in the modern world, yeah, it's happened many times because there's a way of deflating your currency to offset economic troubles. Like Japan and China has done this in the modern age many times. But in like older
Like in a
times,
historical sense, I can't.
I assume that no American or Chinese government will ever go to the situation that happened with the First Crusade. So like that religious fever I was telling you about, and everyone's talking about, let's go to the Holy Land, let's go to the Holy Land. It was insane. Everybody wanted to go. People were obsessed with it, and so many people sold off because you need money. Everyone's telling you need money to make this journey. It's a long way, and you need to have money to buy stuff along the way. You can't carry everything, and also you're going there, you're going to get salvation. Just forget all the material stuff here. So they sold everything. Nobles sold their castles, peasants sold their crops and their animals, and it was on such a high degree that they were out of coinage. Within 1 or 2 years, there was no more coinage, and the prices changed because the whole market failed, but not how it usually fails with inflation, but with deflation. People just couldn't get their hands. All the coins that could be in circulation were in circulation, and people were hoarding them and taking them to the Holy Lands. So for a while, the prices completely broke, and the king of France had to start minting coins because there was no more coins that to do normal trade with.
See, that's to kind of contribute off of that. You're saying nobles are selling their castles and stuff like that. It's funny seeing, I guess you could say, there's Marxists that look back on history, like the Marxist view of history. And whenever Marxists talk about the Crusades, they always say that it was from an economic standpoint, like that it was never about the religious aspect. It was about going and the colonizing and stuff like that. And that's the funniest thing is, like, that's just flat out wrong. It really like, it's from the perspective of these people living in that time. This was a religious duty. This was the give up material possessions and go and do this. And it was something that us in our modern perspective, like, we can't even imagine that. Like, oh, there has to be another reason for that. And it's like, no, they truly believe
they're greedy, they're evil.
Yeah, they're greedy. And it's like, no, they truly believe this was happening. They were doing this for God. And it's hilarious. It's interesting thinking, okay, what 1,000 years ago, what are future historians going to look back on our actions like? Are they going to be like, oh, it was actually for Blimbla or some whatever made up fictional term they'll have for whatever we can't explain today, or it's just interesting. So it's like what we view today is going to completely change, and they'll be like, oh, It was
Yeah.
actually for this reason in the future. Yeah.
It is often less about ideology and more for some means. Like even with the war in Ukraine right now, like not enough people are talking about the fact that the Donbas actually is the second biggest reserve of natural gas after Norway. Like
Yeah.
that should be more in the news.
I
And
talk about it to everyone I know. I had to
yeah,
explain to my
me
family
too.
it's all about the gas, man.
Mhm.
Actually, that's pretty interesting. That's probably how it's going to be taught 100 years from now. Like,
For sure.
you know,
Probably.
it'll be like, oh, these weren't over political issues or anything that we're talking about today. They'll say, oh, it was over resources being depleted. It was over things that we don't have today, like natural gas won't exist, in the future. And they'll be like, oh, it was over these energy resources that were being depleted. And even if we say today, oh, it was actually over these political reasons, future people will just be like, no,
Yeah.
it was over the resources. It was over it was over that.
I kind of laugh at like say the opium wars and all of the things that were done for things like spices and tulips, but maybe that's exactly how future generations will feel like oh they fought all these wars for like fossil fuels. Imagine they ran their whole economies in their world on fossil fuels. So
They
primitive.
didn't have like little nuclear reactors in their cars or something. I don't know, whatever future people have. It'll
Yeah.
probably just be nuclear energy. It'll just be like, oh, they didn't have nuclear energy.
Hello, future people.
Yeah, hello, future
Studying
people.
this podcast.
We called it first.
Yeah.
You were talking about deflation, and I'm wondering, is that the same? I mean, this is there's a lot of myth involved in this, mind you, but the African king, Mansa Musa, there's a tale of when he brought so much damn gold on his travels, like through Egypt or wherever, that it completely screwed up the economies of the area. Although I've heard from sources this is completely like over exaggerated.
But that's like the opposite, isn't it? Like he's putting more coinage in circulation, not taking it out.
Yes. So okay, yeah, you're right. That is.
What would that do to the market?
True. Wait, you're right. That isn't deflation. That's a completely different situation.
Yeah. Welcome to the historical economy podcast.
Oh, my background.
Real quick, before I forget, because we mentioned Normandy, did you guys know that my God. So like there's William the Conqueror, there's his son, there's his grandson who died on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and I'm not sure exactly how the family tree goes, but there's this one guy who Robert of Normandy, he was supposed to be king of England, but he basically fought it was his son. Okay, so William the Conqueror's son was very impulsive, and his brothers one day did a prank on him by dumping a bucket of shit on his head. So he got very mad and started a rebellion and beat William the Conqueror.
What?
So I'm not making this up. So William the Conqueror loses to his son after his son was pranked with shit on his head from his brothers, and they go in a duel. And William the Conqueror loses the duel, and the son is about to kill him, but then sees his father, and his father is like super mad at him. So they make a truce, but he's very alienated despite being like the first son. Pretty sure it's the same guy. Yeah. Oh, yeah. William the Conqueror's son, father died on the pilgrimage. Sorry, the father of William the Conqueror died on the pilgrimage. So anyway, William the Conqueror's son, he basically gets given Normandy. The younger son gets given England, and you make do with Normandy, which at the time, weirdly enough, it was an equal split. The Normandy was so powerful and so rich as all of England combined, right? So the thing is that he was pretty salty. He didn't like his brother. He was upset that he wasn't king of both, as his father was. So after he got his ideas and he wrote with the Pope, he really wanted to go to the Holy Lands. So he he basically leased the Duchy of Normandy to his younger brother.
Oh wow.
To get 10,000 denarii or whatever to go to the crusade. He goes to the crusade, he wins, he comes back home, and he's like, I'm back, give me the Duchy of Normandy back. And his brother's like, nah, it's mine now. And they go over and they fight a war, and he loses. And some historians speculate that if that didn't happen, like if the First Crusade didn't happen, Normandy would split up and detach itself from England much earlier and fundamentally change the relationship that England had, making England a lot weaker as economy, as a power base and everything, and also give it a far weaker claim on France later for the 100 Years' War.
Wow, that would have been one of the small little changes in the last
Yes,
episode.
don't pour a bucket of shit on your brother's head. Yeah. Yeah.
That's one of the
Robert
biggest examples of
Kurtholz.
pranks gone wrong. Like that's
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely prank gone wrong. Robert Kurtholz is his name for those of you who want to Google him.
Wow. I'm learning so many things today.
Cody, did
Yeah.
you want to talk about the card?
Oh yeah, I mean, it would be hard for him not to pick Teddy, but Cody, basically we have this little card game where
Yeah.
all of our patrons, depending on their tier, they receive a figure every month of their choosing, and there are 5 different tiers. One is garbage, like terrible leader, terrible commander, terrible scientist. There's 5 classes: leader, commander, scientist, artist, and wildcard. 2 is pretty bad, but okay, doable. At least you're not a 1. 3 is capable, decent. 4 is very good, and 5 in the leader category is Augustus or Alexander as a commander. So
wow, you said Alexander and not Chinggis.
I mean,
my chest is already like, whoa.
I'm obviously
like,
Chinggis
what
is better.
What is happening?
Inside jokes.
We have another guy that's our other friend who's like an Alexander fanboy, and these guys, Gorky is like the greatest Mongolian fanboy that there's ever lived, and they just butt heads every episode.
Cody, come on. Who is a better conqueror, Alexander or Chinggis? Back me up here.
Oh, Chinggis by far.
Oh, of course,
Yeah.
It's not even a brainer. It's not. It shouldn't even be a thing. But the point is, every guest, we like to give you something, offering, if you will. So we want to give you a card with your name on bottom, which will forever be yours. That figure will forever be taken. It will be, we'll put a nice design on it, and so we want to ask you, what's a figure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it is, or whatever culture it's from. What's someone historical figure that means a lot to you that you want to put your name on?
I mean, honestly, I feel like we talked so much about Teddy. Yeah, you're right. We gotta do it. We talked about it so much.
We're doing it.
We gotta do it.
All right. 3 things. I think you don't even need to explain why he means so much to you, but if you want to, go ahead. 2, I'm sorry for the potential patron who really wanted to go Teddy and now can't. And most importantly, 3, are you giving him a 5 out of 5 or a 4 out of 5? Because this is tricky.
Ooh.
5 is really the greats. Like 5.
Put him on the level of like Alexander, Chinggis.
Alexander's a commander.
I would. Ooh.
Yeah. On the level of Augustus. Let's think of like leader-wise. Who are the 5s off the bat? I think it's Augustus, Bismarck. Let me think of a couple of other ones.
Well, you have to choose an American.
Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great.
Yeah.
Peter the Great.
Peter, maybe. Like one of them is a 4, one of them's a 5. I'm not sure who.
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Absolutely.
So on that level, are you putting Teddy up there, or are you putting him as a 4?
I'd give him a 4. I could say he's a 4. I think 5. I don't know which I would say Lincoln probably is a 5. Maybe I could call Lincoln a 5.
We had someone who chose Lincoln, right? I think
Flashpoint History actually picked Lincoln, and we all agree he's a 5.
There we
go.
For a
5 and is his card.
There we go. Okay, you know what? Yeah, so I could say Teddy is I love him. He's definitely a 4 out of 5 though.
Nice. We're building a Rushmore, boys.
Slowly and surely. Yeah. Now we see who picks Washington and Jefferson. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, that was a great concept. I love that. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, I'll send you the card as soon as I make it. But yeah, it will look good.
That was incredible. So, did you want to keep doing questions, or I don't know what the
Craig, how are we on time?
I think we cleaned an hour.
We
in
cleaned
an
an
hour?
hour.
Do you want to do one more question to wrap it up, or
Sure.
Yes.
How about
Yeah.
Cody
Let's
chooses?
wrap it up with something
No
strong.
slavery, no American politics.
yeah,
I don't know what you
nothing. That was a lot more political than I really wanted it to be, but
Yeah.
you were asking questions, and I had to. Craig, was I too much? I don't know. I was just answering this question.
Not at all.
Like, I'll let the audience know that I'm very knowledgeable about current American politics because I'm Canadian. We're boring people. That's all we look into. He was right down the middle, saying the most appropriate, safe stuff. You're fine. You're fine.
Okay. All right.
Nice.
That's cool.
As a
All right,
final
next.
thing, Cody, I honestly think I want to give the ball to you and throw it any direction you want.
Any good
Yeah.
ending question? Okay.
Go all
Man, as a reversal, I'm gonna have to think. Okay. In terms of who do you think? Okay, I'm gonna end it on this one. What do you think is the most misunderstood event in our current day? Like an event from history that people just get flat out wrong. And not modern, or we're going to make it medieval. We're going to keep it medieval and ancient, not anything political, but something that the general public gets the wrong idea on. Can be an event, a person, a historical event, just anything, broadest thing possible.
I got mine without a doubt. I've spoken about this on the podcast multiple times, and I've went in depth. I don't know which episode it was, Craig, but I went in depth. But the gist of it is, and this is a lesson that applies for all chapters of history. There's a British guy, a very rich, talented person who speaks 7-8 languages, and decided to spend the full duration of the Second World War roaming the East and being absolutely fascinating by Byzantine culture and history. That man is called Theodore Roosevelt, and he wrote the playbook for the Crusades. He has 4 tomes that are really big, and he very much is, he was a contemporary of George Orwell, good friend. They studied, I think, French together, and a brilliant writer. And he managed to compile all of these sources that he had the access to because he knew Latin. He knew Arabic. He knew so many languages that allowed him to get the scoop. Sadly, he was biased. I believe all of us are. But for a British man in the mid-20th century, who was the first one to write history on a popular level, like it was a bestseller. His books were a bestseller, and everybody were reading them. But he had an agenda. He basically said that the Crusaders went to war against 2 civilizations. One was superior civilization. He meant the Byzantines. A little bit of Islamophobia in there, but the gist of it is that he wanted to victimize the Byzantines, and he wanted to blame the Crusaders for everything they've done. And the way he's telling those stories, especially as they pertain to the Fourth Crusade, and making them black and white and flat out making up facts, he is condemned pretty much. Condemned is a strong word, but every academic expert on the topic says that you should not read his books because you will like them because the writing is good, but what the story they tell is almost fictional. It has enough history for it to sound historical, for you to believe that it happened, but in essence, everything about Venice is wrong. Everything about the Crusader motivations is wrong because he wants to make it black and white. The Byzantines are made to look like, this sweetheart that did nothing wrong, and they didn't do nothing to deserve this. And it's very much like a propaganda piece, and those stains are hard to wash out. You can go with a topic that's misunderstood because people don't know about it because it's ignorance, but I feel like unlearning something you already learned in school or whatever, or through memes, is much harder than learning something you have no knowledge on.
I like that.
All right.
Yeah, that was exactly that was what I was looking for. That's good. Craig, how about you?
Yeah, I don't know if I've said this enough. I'm like a Pacific War guy, so I do more modern history, but I like ancient history, and I'd say it's the vilification of the Persian Empire. And
Mm.
it goes hand in hand with the glorification of a lot of the Greek events. For
Yeah.
example, Battle of Thermopylae, Marathon. The general public, I mean, it's been going on forever, has this like mythical thing in their head that, oh, the Persians, for some reason, unbeknownst, attacked the poor Greeks and did all this. And they don't know about the Ionian Wars, and the Greeks were the first
Yeah.
ones to come in and do what they did.
Hmm.
And, then they think it's this triumphant thing, like, oh my God, the Greeks managed to put up this grand fight when the Persians were going somewhere else, and it was like a detour. They fought. Yeah, they lost a few battles, but it didn't really do much. They didn't care so much about it. It was a minor issue. And then it's always told to us just before we learn the story about Alexander the Great and why he went to fight these feminine, like dumb, degradable people when in fact, like the Persian Empire was kind of like this amazing place, it kind of had a bit of a cosmopolitan edge to it and did all these great things. And the vilification of Darius, especially, it's like it's Alexander's little propaganda team telling us all these things, and he's writing these like hilarious letters just degrading the guy in that, and it's overwhelming. Like you talk to people from the area of the world, and they know certain things like that Greek mercenaries were used by the Persians, so it's actually a lot of Greeks versus Greeks. But you ask, honestly, I've worked as a bartender in a lot of restaurants and stuff back in the day. You ask any Greeks today, they're like, they don't know anything about that. They only know the overglorified mythical stories of how their people like won this grandiose battle over this evil villain. It's like the Schneider cut basically of it.
Yeah.
Damn.
Snyder cut of history.
Yeah.
Oh, that's not, so. In terms of, I know you don't want to do political, but in terms of like a modern, since you are more of a modern historian, what I guess Japan related, Pacific, Orient, I mean, any of the very misconceptions, which one would you pick? Probably that people don't know.
God, because we in a previous episode, I actually had to dig into this, and it's one that you've talked about in one of your videos. It's a question about, we'll call it the justification for the nuclear bombs. Now, there is a justification for the nuclear bombs to have been dropped, but they're not for the reasons that have been told to the public for so long. The Operation Downfall and everything, and the idea that unbelievable millions of Americans were going to die assaulting Japanese soil. It's kind of ridiculous as a justification for the nuclear bombs. Nuclear bombs, in essence, were dropped because of the Soviet Union. It was to scare the Soviets, and from the point of view of the Japanese, they were already surrendering, and what tipped the scale was Manchuria being invaded. It was the most important thing to their entire empire. It was the last big nugget that they had left. And they thought they were going to surrender to the Soviets. When the Soviets did that, the Japanese were doing meetings in the week time period when the two bombs went off. And when the first bomb went off, they had no idea when they're having the meeting. And I think even when the second bomb went off, if I remember correctly, they were like involved in the second meeting. So they had already made their surrender plan. Now, from the point of view of the Americans, the argument has always been, Operation Downfall would have led to like millions upon millions of deaths. That the women and children in Japan were going to take bamboo spears and fight to the last.
Yeah.
Perhaps at the time, maybe some Americans believed this, like high commanders, but it was bogus. The Japanese population was starving. They're dead. They had been blockaded for like 2 solid years at this point. Populace couldn't do it anymore. Japanese high government knew that they had lost halfway through the war. They had no illusions about it. But the thing that the United States didn't know for a long time was that the United States, Douglas MacArthur of all people, he had to have Hirohito remain on the throne, and they had to sign the Constitution in the way that was amendable to the United States. And they had to put up a lot of lies. So for a long time, they just kind of went with this narrative about all these things and justifications for actions so that the Japanese would play ball and be the bulwark against communism. And it's a very, very scrutinized issue. To this day, if you mention it, like, there's going to be Americans screaming right now if they hear this. But
I think one of the most interesting things when seeing how the Japanese government reacted to the nukes is just how little they did. And it wasn't because it was like, oh, they had this suicidal idea of
150,000
sacrifice or whatever.
are
It was
dead in
because
Tokyo from
yeah,
firebombs.
yeah, 50,000 dead in Tokyo, and the way these meetings go too is just so different than
Impersonal.
any.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's they're so slow. They're oddly way too formal, and it's just like the process is a very slow one, and also they don't frankly care. They really didn't care that much of civilians dying. Now, if it was their own, then they would. But
Yeah, of course. I mean,
yeah,
they're not monsters. But another point to make, which a lot of
yeah.
people might not know about the Pacific War, is if you have any books that were written before about 1991, you can throw them in the garbage. Hirohito's personal notes, which still haven't been made fully public, were not public until he died. When we got those notes, it implicated him in so many specific decisions. He was responsible for allowing for the continuation and for specific atrocities. And the history books would never tell you that because it was against the narrative about him.
Well, they had to justify keeping him on the throne, and it was like there was a lot of reasons why they did, and of course, but Americans had to justify it. So
it's all about the sources, man.
Yeah,
it's all about the sources.
But you made a video explaining what could have occurred if the Soviets ran amok, and it would be a much more horrible world, I would say.
I remember there was one video I did that I think I fully bought into the narrative that Americans were going to invade Japan and die. And that was one of my oldest videos, but there's a lot of videos that I look back on and I kick myself over. So it's like, that's why I try to not promote my older ones, because it's like, I bought into this massive misconception that really shouldn't have done. And the scenarios are built out of that misconception.
Yeah. You can still argue that the Americans are, of course, they're going to assault the mainland, but not after a few 100,000 flying fortresses have literally leveled all human beings.
Man.
The firebombing campaign of Dresden is as terrible. Like it's really bad, but what they did to Tokyo is immeasurable. It's disgusting. It's really bad.
I think it's just the term firebombing. It doesn't elicit that reaction that like nuclear bombing. Like both are terrible, but like firebombing is very under thought about, I guess you could say, for lack of better words.
They didn't want it in the history books, especially Churchill. Churchill was very disgusted by Dresden.
Yeah, and it's like, that's it muddles. You don't want to muddle the history, especially when it comes to propaganda and stuff like that.
What about you, Cody?
Yes, for not a depressing. I don't know why this keeps getting depressing. We do this. I'm gonna say I'm not gonna say an event or anything controversial. I'm gonna say the entire region of Southeast Asia is very underrepresented when talking about history. Yeah. I only recently became fascinated with like Cambodia and Vietnam and all of Indonesia and Myanmar and just the cultures of like Siam and stuff like that. Yeah. And it's just this whole world. Indonesia, it's this whole world that's just it's a blend of different cultures, blend of Confucianism and Indian Hinduism and Buddhism, and you add that little Islamic theocracy into it, and it's just this world that's never really talked about by the West, and even less so than Africa, because at least Africa's talked about. Southeast Asia is never ever talked about, despite Indonesia being the fourth largest country and the fourth most populous country in the world, and it's just never talked about. I think just anything in history, learn more about it. It's fascinating. I've wanted to do a few videos about it for a while, but I also know that if I do anything about it, it's not gonna get the views, and I need to not be a coward and I don't know. See if your audience wants it. See if one idea.
Leave a comment in below if you really want to see some South Asian content.
I'll give you one idea. I got pushed to make one. I have like a large group of Filipinos. I'm going to still make something in the Filipinos, but I had this huge group of Vietnamese who wanted content. But I was doing World War I in Asia, so I wanted to do China, Japan, and other areas. And then they're like, we want something for Vietnam. So I did French Indochina and Siam. And I found out that, like, beyond my knowledge, they're much more involved in World War I than A lot
That
of other
actually
nations.
is a really good point. Especially like there's a lot of people right now very interested in history from the Philippines and Indonesia in particular.
Yeah.
Huge groups, as well as the Caucasus, fascinating region, very not talked about, but especially the Georgians, like there's such a strong Georgian community with huge numbers of viewership and history videos that I think the pendulum's going to swing, and some of these regions may get the traction they deserve. And it's on us to provide some good content to be watched.
Yeah. Represent the ones that fall between the cracks and all that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think that's a good way to end it, though.
Definitely.
It's a lot
Definitely.
better than slavery and American politics.
Well, just a
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah, just a bit. But to make it even a little bit lighter, I deeply want to thank you, Cody, because I've been watching your videos since before I even became a writer and got involved on the other side of the equation and
Oh.
producing, not just consuming content. And you really are special. And I really thank you for everything you've done, even like not just being on the podcast, but I'm sure a lot of people have grown up watching your content. And I think today they got to see a side of you that maybe they normally don't. They got to see a person who is very knowledgeable, but is also willing to change their opinion. And I think that's everything there is to it. We all have our biases, but as long as we grow and we learn from each other, that's all that matters. And yeah, I really hope to see you again. Maybe partnered up with someone else that we can all learn from. And yeah, thank you for making this happen. We deeply appreciate it.
Oh, thank you guys so much. I mean, I loved every minute of this. This went. I mean, I've never been on a podcast or anything this long before, and
Yeah.
I appreciate you guys. You guys are great hosts. It's so natural. So anytime you ever want me back on, I would love to do it. So
Thank
thank
you
you so
so
much.
much. Thank you so
much.
much. All right, guys. Craig, you want to wrap this up?
Gorgie stole my thunder. I've seen like all your videos, and you literally got me to be a YouTuber. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. And I made alternate history videos just because of you. But I'm not gonna continue there. This has been questioning history. I'll stop being a fanboy. Over and out.
See you guys.